Welcome everyone to Guardian Australia Rural Network's book club. This is our second book club and we're very lucky to have Rick Morton here. Actually, I think in a hotel room for the Brisbane Writers Festival right now. Welcome, Rick.
It's good to be here and everywhere.
Thank you for coming. And of course, Rick was, for those of you who followed the vote of our books, was top of the pops, not just for this book that we're going to discuss today, which is Growing Up in Country Australia, but also for 100 Years of Dirt. So we might have to wrangle you back later in the year, Rick, to talk about that book, which was fabulous.
I will come back anytime you ask.
Okay. I wanted to acknowledge Wiradjuri elders past, present and emerging. This is the country that I am sitting on outside of Harden. And let's get started. Now, can you just, for people who we had a couple of people saying, "Oh, I'm in the line at the library for Growing Up in Country Australia." So if people aren't familiar with you, just give us a potted version of your childhood growing up in Western Queensland.
Yeah, I'll give you the quick version. It's going to be a real speedy one. But I grew up on a cattle station about 15 hours west of Brisbane, where I am now. So it was 1,000 square kilometres, west of Charleville, Quilpie, Eromanga, and then almost South Australia is where we were. And, it was actually a pretty good childhood. It was just my brother and I for the first 7 years of my life. And then my sister was born, and 3 weeks after that, my brother was involved in this horrific accident where he was burned to, third-degree burns to 45% of his body and almost died. And, following that, he was in hospital for 2 months after being flown out by the Royal Flying Doctor Service. And my mum was there with him and my sister, and I was kind of stuck at home on the station with my dad, who then proceeded to have an affair with the governess, which is bad luck, I think. And then, when it all fell apart, he kind of froze bank accounts and kicked us out, and mum was left to raise the three of us in poverty, essentially, in regional Queensland.
So given that childhood, which you've written so eloquently about in 100 Years of Dirt, how do you then approach this collection as an editor? Because rural Australia has this kind of mythic status, I reckon, in white Australia particularly. And it seems to me, when I came to it as an adult, a lot of it's kind of set in almost archetypal images, ideas of people, stereotypes. So how did you approach it as an editor when you were asked to do this?
Actually, a really good point. And I was a little bit worried about it because in so many ways, my experience growing up, particularly when we're on the station in outback Queensland, is the archetype. My father was the archetype. It's almost embarrassing how stereotypical we were. We were settlers on First Nations land, going back generations. The Morton side of the family were almost certainly involved in, certainly oppressing Indigenous people, if not actually involved in the massacres themselves in the frontier wars. So I was acutely aware of the fact that, my experience is not the only experience. And so I was, very keen to put a lot of effort into finding the stories that actually represent a modern telling of Australia, because I really wanted first, migrants who had just landed in Australia, rather than settling in the cities, who came into rural and regional towns. I wanted to have First Nations people writing about their connection to country, but also just interviewing First Nations people about their own lives without necessarily having to link it to their indigeneity. And also the queer kids and the hippies and the vegans and all of the people that you don't expect to be thrown into the country, rural Australia mix. Certainly not in my family, because we were terrified of vegetarians growing up. So I wanted to have that kind of, a modern update about it, because the older I got, the more I realized there was a lot more to it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that stood out for me in the book was, how fixed our ideas have been coming to rural Australia. But that representation that you've got in the book across not just people, but places and environments was really fantastic. Are we sentimental about rural Australia?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we are. It's very easy to be. And in fact, even with all of my kind of, proactive thought about how to update these stereotypes, there is still an element of country Australia where it is kind of stereotypical. Like it is very much about place. It is this, a connection to the land and the animals and, this kind of feeling that you have around you while you're there. And it can be very easy to get sucked into that against, things that are real problems in country Australia, such as, lack of access to proper healthcare in certain regions, the elevated rates of, violence, accident, heavy machinery injuries, all of these things, which are difficult to live with at the best of times, and certainly they don't spring to mind when you're talking about the lovely stories in the bush. So it's a delicate line to walk. But at the same time, I'm, if you love something, then love it and love it fully. And I think there are a lot of people in this collection who really love country Australia, and I don't blame them.
Okay, let's look at some of the themes. Class and social status has been something that I think has infused your work, and I've thought about a lot too in my work. How set is social status, do you think, in rural Australia? And just speak to some of the essays maybe where that really came out for you.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the things that I had forgotten, and possibly because I started out in the landed gentry class, was the difference between farmers and townies, because there is still a huge kind of gulf between the experience of people who grew up in country towns and people who grew up in land outside of country, or on land outside of country towns. And typically those are the ones who get to go to boarding school, who get to go to the nicer schools in the city, have some kind of entree to how to live and get by in these big, to me anyway, metropolises when I was, which is something I never got. Even when we moved to Boona, which was much closer to Brisbane, we never went because we didn't have money. And so there's a whole thread throughout these essays of people who are either moving around a lot and never actually get to settle in any of these towns. And that's so common as well, people who follow the work because it's so transient in many locations, or they're kind of in town and they're on the fringes of town and they don't have a lot of money. They've been raised by a single mum or a single dad because it's the cheapest place for them to find rent. And that's kind of their lot in life. And there's not a lot of inclusion necessarily for people like that. But at the same time, if you're not at the either end of the extreme, there is a remarkable blending, I think, somewhere in the middle there, which you don't necessarily get in your kind of friendship circles or how you socialize in the city, which is that, everyone kind of feels the same. There's not any ostentatious show of wealth, even if people are well off. Especially if you're landed, you might, hide it all and tell everyone that you're broke when the drought comes, and you still buy the new Prado the next year, which is, not uncommon. But, I do think there is a little bit of a kind of, it's harder to see the division sometimes if it's not, if it is class and not racial, for instance, it can blend together.
Yeah, I like Tom Plevy's description of not being either of the land or of town, that funny space in between where you feel like you're neither part. When did you first become aware of class as a kid? Was that in the moment that your family split?
Do you know what? No, it wasn't until I got to university. Even knowing how hard up we were, and because Mum shared more with me than she otherwise would have, because I was a bit of a freak kid, so I was always asking questions and things like that. So I knew that we didn't have money to buy things, and I knew that she really, really, really struggled, and that she made all these sacrifices. But I just kind of assumed that most families were like that, because in my orbit in Boona, most families were sort of like that. They might not have struggled as much as we did, but they didn't have much beyond the basics, and it wasn't too far removed from what we had. And then I went to uni, and it didn't help, of course, that I got a scholarship to Bond, which is a private university. It was filled with legitimately, properly wealthy people. But I think I would have felt the same way if I'd gone to UQ, where I was also accepted, because you get that melting pot of people who really do come from nice families, quote unquote. I mean, the only reflection I had ever had on class, I think, when I was in high school, was my friend's family who bought, well, they didn't buy it, they built a house. And I remember people discussing at the time going, I think it cost them $350,000. And we were like, holy shit, like how the hell did they afford that? And it was a nice house. It was a really nice house. And they used to play board games and invite me around. And I felt like they were adopting me so they could teach me how to be civilized.
What about race? How did you choose all of those different essays around race? Because you get these kind of contradictions where on the one hand, Tom Plevy, who's one of our network journalists, talked about only being treated differently because of his race when he moved to the city, as opposed to Sam Leung, who talks about very much being on the outer of the other in Geraldton in Western Australia. So how do you think about race when you think putting a collection like this together?
I mean, I think the only thing I can do is trust the voice. So, you know, we've got recollections from Yusuf Saudi when he's talking about being called these horrible slurs by his ostensible friends in Alice Springs. But he doesn't really pick up on it at the time because so much of our worldview, whether, you know, we're white or otherwise, is brokered by the people around you. And if that's all you know, then that's all you know. So, you know, he didn't really become aware of it until much later in life. And certainly, you know, Lily Chan's written such a beautiful piece in this collection as well, which I love. And to the extent that it's commented on at all, it's particularly common for, you know, Faz Adraki when she's writing about, you know, when she went to visit her family in Iran and her schoolmates asking her if she met Osama bin Laden when she was over there. You know, sometimes it's obvious and you can't get away from it. But even then, it's about the little things. I think there's a lot of commentary around the food. It's like, oh, you don't eat the same things as us. That's a bit strange. You've got raisins with your meat. What are you doing? But even I was vaguely aware of that growing up, but I was aware of it from my own point of view, which is that I didn't understand any of these other cultures and had never tried anything, including anything from the local Chinese shop. They still sold quarter chicken and chips on the menu for people like me. And so I used to order that, even though, you know, Lena Ma, their daughter was in my year in primary school. And so and they had a birthday party that they catered with Chinese food, and I was starving by the end of it because I was terrified.
Yeah. What about social norms? Elena Dean talks about learning to publicly disagree with people.
Yeah.
And that really struck me because, you know, there's this weird, oh no, we can't comment on or call something out that's a bit dodgy because, you know, it's almost like there, but for the grace of God go we don't want to be called out on it. And I just see it a lot with farmers, you know, who might have a view about environmental practices or various other things, and they'll say, oh no, I don't want to talk about that, or animal welfare, because, you know, we don't talk about things like that.
Yes,
and you see it in politics all the time. Like, you just not allowed to talk about politics if it's something outside of what the convention is.
Yeah, God, that's a really good point. I mean, the one thing, I'm not sure it taught me to disagree. I was very bad at disagreeing for a very long time, but again, this is just personal experience. But certainly it made me very aware, and still does, the fact that there are people with wildly different politics out there in the world. I know it's hard to believe sometimes. You know, we get paid out for it as journalists, but I think rightfully so. We live in a media bubble, and it's very easy, we're seeing it in the election, to get sucked into thinking that something might be, okay, or actually happening, when it's really not front of mind at all in the vast majority of people around the country. You know, I went home over the summer holidays over Christmas back to Boona, and I had afternoon tea with my friend's parents, who are community theatre nerds who also vote One Nation. It makes no sense. Although maybe there's a big community theatre following in Pauline Hanson's One Nation party, but, you know, and funnily enough, I was talking to them about politics, and then they were like, but tell you what, and they would never have voted Labor in a million years, but they're like, tell you what, love Anastasia Palaszczuk. She's really surprised us, and it was because she closed the border during COVID. And so it's like, there's a real kind of pragmatism is the wrong word, because I think, to people of a certain life experience, if they haven't been troubled or affected by racism or things like that, that we should care about, then they overlook all of those things and they're happy to vote very much based on their nose. And it might be based off, a glimpse of something on the commercial TV news, and that's it. So yeah, it may be aware of those things, but I wasn't very good at disagreeing with them for a very long time.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit to landscape? I think Jacinta Dietrich's piece about, she didn't even think she grew up in country Australia because she grew up in a rainforest area. This kind of idea that probably landscape is much like the landscape that you grew up in, that is arid, semi-desert, big wide open plains. That is the country Australia experience.
I've been joking about this during the press tour for this book, because I had to fight my own biases when I was doing the essays for this, because heaps of essays were from coastal towns, and in my head I'm like, it's not country, which I know it is. I was being silly, but like genuinely, when I think country, I think red dirt, which is the correct color for dirt in my head. I think completely flat. And you can see the entire horizon and nothing beyond it. I keep quoting Jill Kirk-Conway in her book Road to Karain, where she talks about being able to see everything all at once makes it feel like there's an annihilation of the self. And so when I think about growing up out there, that's the kind of very smallness that I like to feel in country Australia. But of course, you don't feel small at all in a rainforest. You feel trapped or enclosed or really close to something that's quite beautiful and not atrophied or clinging to life through its own ingenuity and survival mechanisms, like the mulga shrub, which the leaves point directly up at the middle of the day. So, and it's completely the opposite. So like reading the breadth of those takes, and it's even the pieces in this collection that are not explicitly about the feeling of being in the landscape, it permeates everything, because I think it is the number one experience about living in regional Australia, because you just are so close to it. And I think it's the best way to grow up, full stop, is to have access to those things.
How hard is it to be different in country Australia? Do you think rural people are less tolerant?
I don't think they are. I really don't think they are, actually, and in fact I know that they're not. But it's the way of expressing tolerance is different, and the understanding they might have for something new is not always there. Certainly, I just again, just thinking back, it's hard to overstate how sheltered I was growing up. I knew nothing. There was one multicultural family in town. It was the Chinese family. That was it. And I had never kind of ventured beyond the town limits. We went to Brisbane a few times, mostly just to take my brother to the children's hospital for checkups after his burns. And it was a absolutely frightening experience, because Mum used to make us plan everything in the Refidex, turn by turn, in case we got lost. So, I was one of those people where I don't think I was an intolerant person, but I certainly, that might have been the cleanest, I don't know. But I certainly didn't know how to express or even be aware of people out there in the world who lived different lives to me. Even when I knew I was gay in high school, the only gay person I knew of was one of the characters on Secret Life of Us. And I thought that was wild. I'm like, imagining his existence, going, he must get like abused every second of every day. So I think the expressions or the way people know how to talk about other existences is a little bit diminished sometimes. But of course, I'm talking about an era before wide open communications, and we had dial-up internet, but as you know, that was pretty shonky at the best of times. So I think a lot of that's changing, and people do have access. But there is, I won't keep rambling, but I do think there is a slightly more egalitarian streak where people do want to take you as you are. I think that sometimes the latent judgment is still there, even when they think they're being really helpful and nice. And that's the last frontier, I guess, in terms of, true acceptance.
Yeah, I wonder whether we just make assumptions, though, that you could be as intolerant in the city it's just harder to see. Everything, it seems to me, everything is so easy to see in the country because it's
bingo
in front of you, and you know, you go to school with the kids that from a wide range of socio-demographic areas, at least till the end of public, you know, primary school. And so you can see it all.
There's no hiding from it.
Yeah.
It's like living in an ant farm. You can see every tunnel and twist and turn. And that's for the better, I think, for the most part. You can easily be anonymous in the city. You know, intuitively, it doesn't make any sense at all, but it's the best place to hide is in a crowd.
So are there any, can you ascribe characteristics to people who grew up in country Australia?
I mean, I could, and I would, but what I will say first is that, you know, most of my friends in Sydney, without having thought about it or planned this in any way, because that would be absolutely psychotic behaviour, are from the country. They just happen to be almost exclusively from the country or regional Australia. Why is that the case? I think there's an openness to country people. I think there is a willingness to kind of approach, to say hello, and to not be overly guarded. Like, I think everyone's got their private lives, of course, but, you know, you want to chat about the weather? Just chat about the weather. Like, it can be done. And I think that is, you know, overwhelmingly, I think there is an openness that you don't get in the city. There's a sense of cloisteredness that I think you get in the city, where people are, you know, they won't necessarily talk to their neighbours, not always, but generally speaking. I want to, but they keep running away from me in the hallways. I don't know what I did. So I think maybe that's it. I wouldn't want to go much further than that, but do you find that?
Yeah, I do. And my kids laugh at me because, you know, even though I didn't grow up in the country, you know, I think I've taken on the culture pretty well. And so I talk to everyone. They are constantly embarrassed about how many people I talk to, and on the train or when I go to the city or wherever. Mum, you don't have to talk to everyone.
Yeah, that's like, but we do. We do.
That's right, we do. I do remember my daughter saying when we went to the city very early on, she was only about 2 or 3, she was asking who it was in all of the cars, because we knew everyone, so therefore we would know who was in the car next door at the traffic lights. Of course,
you know, I even during this book too, I keep telling that story from the start of Rusted Off, your book, about your friend's daughter who came to visit, was like, who cut all the houses down. Because it's such a beautiful way of like flipping the expectation.
Let's talk about politics now. How do you describe the politics of country Australia? What do you ascribe it to? And that split, particularly given you grew up in Queensland, you know Queensland so well. And so that split that we're seeing in voting patterns between the North, Queensland and WA largely, compared with the southeastern states. How do you think about that as a country person, and some of the narrative that you see about, you know, those dumb Queenslanders, why don't they get, you know, that sort of thing that I often get when I write pieces?
Do you know, I mean, I'll preface this by saying I'm the worst political observer in the world. Like, I am quite naive.
You're a people observer, though.
I'm a people observer, and so what I do know, and my mum would be one of these people that, you know, people in progressive circles, I don't know how my mum votes, but they would certainly be like, you know, the mere fact that mum said the other day that someone was a bit mean to Scott Morrison would be proof that these are the quote unquote dumb voters who are going to return him in government. And I absolutely fucking hate that kind of talk. No matter, you know, what your politics are, to kind of slag off a group of voters when you don't actually know their motivations for voting is, well, it's just awful for a start. And it's not the kind of talk you would actually get in the country, funnily enough. People would ask, well, why? And I think, you know, I think the one thing that Queensland does really well, for better or worse, is actually flip. They're willing to have a go in different circumstances, probably because they're not so, you know, their values or ideals might be a little bit more rusted on, but they're certainly happy to try different people out from different political stripes. Now, the laws of probability will say that you will eventually get a Pauline Hanson and a Clive Palmer and a Bob Katter, but equally you'll get, an Anna Bligh and a Anastasia Palaszczuk with female premiers in a state that, if you listen to progressives in certain circles, is so misogynist it would never ever want a woman to lead them. So, it's a hard thing to read, but certainly I'm not a fan of the external judgment. I am very much a fan of, what isolation does to the psyche.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, Queensland and WA, so they feel like they're so far removed from the rest of the country, and to an extent, I imagine Tasmanians feel like this as well, where it's like, well, you think we're gonna zig, well, we're gonna fucking zag, and you think we're gonna zag, well, zig you. And I think it's because it's kind of like it's like Australia itself, right? We're so far away, we managed to evolve the echidna and the platypus, the world's only monotremes. And if you have a bit of isolation in your political thinking, you can evolve some pretty wacky stuff. And that's what we've done. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There's no accounting for Joh Bjelke-Petersen, unfortunately. But that's who we are as people, I guess. And I'm not going to write the state off because of it.
Do you think there should be a social contract between rural and metro Australia? I'm thinking now about, now I've had a mental blank, Judith Brett's quarterly essay, where a long time, it was probably, 10 years ago. And she talked about the fact that there was this social contract that you could, grow up anywhere, and there would always be this, not only a sharing of the tax base, but also a sharing of the idea that you can live anywhere. And that's, that sparked my interest originally when it came to what the political associations were between rural and metro. Do you think, because, famously, like in the Abbott government, in the early years of Tony Abbott's prime ministership, he talked about lifestyle choices for remote Indigenous communities, which he would never say, I'm sure, for majority white communities. But that idea that, it is going to cost more to provide services in rural Australia rather than having them all bunched together in a metropolitan area. How have you ever thought about, how that might work for the modern era, where cities are so overwhelming and dominant in terms of political terms?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was doing a job out in Western Queensland when I was still at the Australian newspaper, and I was with a photographer. I won't name this photographer because they were mostly trolling and being funny, but we were talking to this councillor on Barcaldine Shire Council at the time. He was a gay man, and he was like, I fucking love it here. And he wasn't particularly conservative. But then the photographer just started kind of winding him up, saying, you reckon that, the country's so important, and because you're the food bowl and you want all these extra services, but like you don't do anything to deserve it. He was like fully going him, and I was getting increasingly uncomfortable because I'm like, hang on a second. Yeah, it was pretty wild, because I was like, well, that's like the favorite talking point of some people in certain metropolitan areas, where it's like, well, what do you do for us? And it's like, well, what we do for you is allow you to have your fucking lifestyle. We feed you for a start. We clothe you in certain circumstances. I know globalization has forced a lot of stuff overseas, but we still grow a lot of things here. And, we export a lot of it. But, the people were talking about the fact that the price of lettuces have gone up. It's because flooding wiped them out in northern New South Wales. And it's like they only notice those things when something goes wrong. But as long as the supply chain's still working, they're happy for us to kind of, people in the country to sit out there and be quiet and not ask for anything in return. And the irony of all of this, I think, is that during the pandemic, we managed to solve one of the tyrannies of distance in this country, which was, using internet and Zoom to conduct your working from home. And of course, that meant a great deal of people from the cities moved to the closest regional centres they could. It's happening in Castlemaine. It's happening in Boona, where my mum lives. It's happening, anywhere that's within an hour and a half of a major city. It didn't happen the other way around. So it's like now people in the country, not only have they not had access to all these services because they didn't deserve it or it was too expensive, rather than getting to escape to the city necessarily, because why would you, are now having their housing prices and rents pushed up because people from the city thought, oh, that'd be lovely. And then, of course, I guarantee you, not that there's anything wrong with this, but those people will very soon start to complain about the lack of services in some of these places. Maybe something will get fixed. I don't know. But it bothers me, that discussion. I mean, the fact is, it is more expensive to deliver these services. I mean, Tasmania famously has one of the most regionalised service delivery systems in the country. And it costs a fortune. It's why their health system is so shocking, because it's so, fragmented. And there are ways of getting around that, but it does need to be a little bit of willpower. And frankly, sometimes things that are worth doing are expensive, then you should do them anyway.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest stories that we've seen is the structure and social services lag with the changing demographics, as people move out to areas, but also there's a real tension, I think, that we're seeing now between, weirdly, those who grew up there, grew up in country Australia, as your book says, and those who have moved in. And I don't know how that plays out.
It feels a little bit prickly at the moment in some places that I've recently been in.
Yeah. Country people chippy, do you reckon?
What do you mean by chippy?
I mean, I often hear narratives that, oh, you've got a chip on your shoulder.
Oh, yes.
You're the title of my book, Why You Should Give a Fuck About Farming.
Yeah,
that is a little bit chippy, I have to say.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm incredibly chippy. I'm so chippy I could be a diner, I think, at this point. And even when I was writing my first book, and then in pretty much everything I've written since, I've worried acutely about whether I just come across as whinging. And I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine this is how other minority groups feel when they're trying to tell you what racism feels like, or they're trying to tell you what, being discriminated against feels like as a trans person. When they're saying these little things add up, right? And it makes the friction in our lives a lot more real, and therefore it's harder to move through life. And that's certainly how I felt, not to the same extent, but coming from a country area, being gay in that country area, not knowing how the world worked, not having the money to navigate that world, or at least make up for my lack of knowledge, which really does help sometimes. If you've got cash and you don't have knowledge, you can smooth some things over. So I think in that sense, yeah, we're chippy. But I think it's all rooted very much so in reality. Like, it is, when I was reading your book, Rusted Off, the thing that really, really spoke to me, and I can't remember the details properly now, was talking about, I think it was a girl who'd gone to university to study medicine or nursing.
Yeah, medicine.
And about just how she was so smart, and she realized that she wasn't actually doing that well because she wasn't prepared at all, I think, for what was a culture shock.
Yeah.
And people in the city just assume, they're like, why wouldn't you know how to catch a train? Why wouldn't you know how to go to university? Because we live with our parents still, and it's pretty easy for us. It's like, well, yeah, you don't have to pay $300 a week, or if you do, you're not completely learning what is essentially a new kind of semiotics in life, which is not what you do in the country. And so, yeah, we're a bit chippy. So what?
Now, we have a question here from Michael Williams asking for advice about running a regional newspaper. So, as someone in the news business, Rick, what advice would you have in terms of, I guess this is a question about stories, and it's a question that I think about a lot as someone who has to edit a rural network, how you walk the line between the diversity of stories. And this is what you've had to do in editing this book.
Well, I mean, I worked for my hometown newspaper. I started out.
What was that called?
It was called the Fassifern Guardian. It still exists.
The Fassifern, yes. That's a great newspaper.
It is a great newspaper. It's family owned, independent, has been since the 1900s. It recently when Rupert Murdoch's News Corp shut down the print edition of the Queensland Times in Ipswich. The first Van Guardian family thought that they would expand, and they initially, and this is instructive for the question, they initially expanded by including the Ipswich area in the same paper as the First Van Guardian, which services the Cynic Rim. And by God, people were not happy. I went home and I was like, well, it's got no news in it anymore, Rick. And of course, it did have a lot of news, but it was news about Ipswich. And what people want still to this day is they want their community reflected in the news. They want to look at the pages and see their kids at their sporting carnival, performing, kicking goals, so the parents can cut out the thing, which is certainly what my mum did. She's got every appearance I ever made in the First Van Guardian from year 7 onwards. But they also want to not be treated like duds. Like, it's kind of like having this discussion as a millennial where it's like, you can care about pop culture and politics. It's possible, and it actually makes you a well-rounded person. And in the country, you can care about getting your friends and family and seeing your community at work and getting the lawn bowl scores, and having all of that stuff in the paper, as well as the good, solid local council reporting where the best stories in Australia are buried, because there are fewer council reporters than ever before. That's the stuff that makes a country newspaper or a regional newspaper work. And if a guy walks in with a 4.3 kilogram pawpaw, as he did with me one day, and asks you to write a story about it, you take the fucking photo of the pawpaw and you write the story. And it's still one of the best stories I've ever done in my life.
Great story. I mean, this book, did it come from you or
no,
were you approached? Because it surprised me that someone would think of it, because rural culture, country culture is such a part of Australian imagination that to think of it as possibly having a different viewpoint surprised me that someone actually came up with that.
I was a bit shocked as well. I mean, it was all Sophie Williams at Black Ink. I mean, she approached me out of the blue. I guess at the time I was probably the most prominent country kid in Australian letters, to use the fancy way of talking about what is essentially the book industry. I already hate myself for saying that. But I'd written 100 Years of Dirt, and they came to me, and I of course said yes. I didn't even think about it. It turned out to be a fuckload of work. I'm sorry I keep swearing, but you brought it out in me, Gabby. Make me feel comfortable.
I do that. Yeah.
And I really wanted to do it because I remember what it felt like to be, I remember a librarian who knew how much I loved writing organised a talk by Hugh Lunn, Queensland writer who's written, Over the Fence, I think it was Over the Fence with Jim, and some great books. And he came to do an author talk, and it was the only time I'd ever met an author in my life. And I was in year 12, and I was absolutely starstruck. And I remember what that felt like, and I don't remember knowing about or hearing about opportunities to write things that might get published, certainly anywhere, but in an anthology, in a book in particular. And so I just remember thinking, well, that's the kind of stuff, I'm at a point now in my career where if I can do something like that, it's actually really nice. And it has been so good. Like, we've done a few events now with some of the contributors, and many of them are new voices, and they've written astonishing pieces. And they are legitimately giddy in the way that I was giddy when I wrote my first book. And that's a good feeling. And I want there to be more of it.
Why do you think it's happened now? Natasha May, our rural reporter, wants to know about the timing, and that it is a good question, because why is Australia ready for a book like this now, when so much of the earlier work have been more stereotypical against the country Australia?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, just blurred out a little bit there, but I think I caught the question. Why now, essentially? And I think it is, I mean, the reason I have my first book, 100 Years of Dirt, was because I wrote a column in response to Mark Latham about, this stupid fight we had. And a publisher saw that column. It was my life in 800 words. Saw that column and wanted an Australian version of Hillbilly Elegy. And I said no, because even then I realized that J.D. Vance, the author, was a insane conservative, alt-right person who had a tremendous story to tell, and he told that part well, but is now, a candidate in Trump's insane, basically. But there was this whole blitz of people wanting to understand, you know, the Rust Belt or the Trump voters or these disaffected white people and what's wrong.
Deplorables. Yeah.
Yes, the deplorables. And so I think, for better or worse, there was, and of course the same thing would try to be replicated here, where it's like, well, we need to, you know, Brexit, Trump, all of these things started happening where we're like, well, suddenly we've got to understand politics. I mean, you wrote Rusted Off around the same time. I think our books came out in the same year or a year apart. And so I think there was at least, if not, you know, if for the wrong reasons, I think, but there was finally a willingness to interrogate some of these things. I think they came from a place of not understanding them, ironically, but the appetite was finally there.
We don't know how the population story is going to play out in rural Australia post-pandemic, because we have seen these population shifts. And I hope my internet is not too laggy, because it has been a bit laggy.
It's doing okay at the moment.
One of the people I interviewed for Rusted Off was Martin Parker. And he went on the head of the Prime Cabinet and the Secretary of Treasury, famously dumped by the Abbott government in the early terms. But he made the point that Ken Henry before him, Bernie Fraser, and Ted, his name will come to me, but basically 4 heads of Treasury in a row had come from little countries and had been informed, you know, in the case of Ken Henry, by his father's work, lowly paid work as a cedar getter. All of these people brought something to public life from that country childhood that I think says a lot. And Martin Parkinson said he would hope that public service, public life, and the people who make decisions about Australia's direction need to have diversity, not only economic and rural metro diversity. How important do you reckon that is for creating, you know, public plans and strategies and inclusion in Australian life?
I mean, it's the only way. I mean, you know, we need it across class, race, disability. Like, it has to be everywhere, because, you know, the moment you create any kind of outsider, and I'm not talking about Trump's outsiders, I'm just talking about any kind of outsider who doesn't feel like they're part of the project, is when you actually, you fail the project. The whole thing comes apart at the seams. And it's kind of what we're witnessing. But certainly with the country, you know, the rural city kind of thing, you know, you've written about this really well, but over time, there has been this massive kind of centrifugal force that has, you know, thrown people out of the country towns, because the ability to stay there if you're young and you want to do something like contribute to public life has been really difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. And a lot of people think, rightly or wrongly, that the opportunities are not there. Forgive me. But I mean, I think that's been particularly acute over the last few decades. And I was asked this question a lot earlier on, not this question, but something similar, where it's like, do you think that, you know, there are more people now in the cities who don't know a single person who lives in country Australia? And I think it's true. I mean, certainly in the quieter, sleepier Australian years, everyone had a cousin in the country. Everyone, you know, the country cousin could go and stay with their city aunt for a bit, or vice versa. Yeah. Certainly we had our cousins who lived in Boona, which I realise is a country town, but we thought it was a metropolis. They came out to the cattle station when I was 5. And I remember like laughing at my cousin Ben trying to shoot a gun, and my dad essentially writing off his masculinity because he couldn't ride a horse, notwithstanding the fact that I also couldn't ride a horse. These are the scars that live with you, Gabby. But I do think things are changing, and if you don't have any attempt to bridge those gaps, then you're going to be left with these, you know, political forces speaking to an electorate that they don't understand. Certainly, that's the National Party's fate at the moment. In many cases, not all of them, where they're talking to a completely different clientele and not the people who live in their actual electorates.
Just cut out. So I think I caught it. One last question, and then we'll end. you live in Sydney at the moment. Will you ever move back to country Australia?
I already want to. I live alone in Sydney, which is fine. I'm very good in my own company. But I would love at this point in my life and in my career where I can do all of my work from home, which is what I do, to live, if not in my hometown, in somewhere where it gets really cold in winter in the mountains, so I can have a fireplace. But the problem with that is that I never leave my house much in Sydney, but at least I know that I could if I wanted to see my friends, and I can see them in half an hour. Whereas I don't know that I could move yet without a long-term partner, like someone to at least just be there, because then I think I would go a little bit mad, in probably the best of ways. And that's why I like returning home as much as I can now, because I just feel so much lighter when I'm there. When I go back to Boona, I feel lighter. I learn within the first 6 hours not to get impatient when I'm trying to order my coffee, and everything seems to be moving through molasses. And then I very quickly, the stress falls out of me in ways that I don't get to experience in the city. So I want it. I'm just not brave enough to choose it yet.
Right. Well, Rick Morton, thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure. Everyone watching, go out and buy this book. It's fabulous. Growing Up in Country Australia. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Gabby.